Claire James had never expected to return to her grandmother's land, much less to build a home on it. For years, the overgrown acre on the edge of the old quarter had been little more than a nostalgic footnote, an untamed slice of wild earth wrapped in rusting barbed wire and half-buried memories of humid summers and sweet tea on folding chairs. The rest of the neighborhood had evolved into neat little rows of stone facade homes and ornamental maples, regulated by a series of unspoken norms and highly spoken complaints. But that corner lot, where the property line met an unpaved path used by dog walkers and shortcutters for decades, had remained defiantly untouched. It had been grandfathered out of modern development schemes, and when Claire inherited it, she saw more than brambles and red clay. She saw freedom. By the time she turned 36, Claire had already spent years working for the city's planning department, vetting endless zoning applications and smoothing out property line disputes for strangers who rarely bothered to thank her. She had a reputation for being precise but not rigid, methodical but never cold. Her strength wasn't in challenging people. It was in understanding rules so well that she could maneuver within them with the kind of grace that left others off balance. When the paperwork finally cleared and the permits came through, she put in the foundation herself. Not literally, though she had briefly considered it. She knew the value of hiring professionals, and she hired the best her modest savings could afford. But the design, the alignment of the structure to the sunlight, the calculated slope to drain water naturally away from the foundation, the soft curve of the gravel drive that avoided cutting into the roots of the wild oaks, those were hers. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly her sense of peace would be tested. The house was barely up to framing when the first raised eyebrow came, courtesy of an older woman with a red watering can and an expertly pruned set of hydrangeas. Claire had just stepped out of her truck when the woman had marched halfway down the sidewalk, fixed her with a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, and asked if she was one of the contractors. When Claire replied no, this was her house, or at least would be soon. The woman's posture shifted subtly, shoulders tensing like she'd heard something rude. That woman, she would learn within the week, was Karen Lawrence, a resident of the neighborhood for nearly 30 years, and in her own words, one of the people who keep this place from falling apart. Karen wasn't elected to any official position. She didn't run the local association, and she wasn't paid by the city to monitor anything. But she monitored all the same, watched comings and goings, filed unofficial feedback with zoning officers, and had once written a 5-page complaint about a neighbor who painted their mailbox in what she described as a non-compliant color, resembling algae. To the outside world, Karen might have seemed like a harmless busybody, but to those who had tried to live near her, she was something else entirely. Relentless. Claire, being Claire, didn't pay the woman much mind. At first, she continued her work on the property, sticking closely to the approved plans, checking in with inspectors on schedule, and even going out of her way to avoid scheduling disruptive work during early mornings. Still, by the time her fencing crew arrived, 2 weeks ahead of schedule thanks to a cancellation, Karen had already lodged a complaint. She claimed that construction noise exceeded local ordinances, that the positioning of the house felt aggressive in relation to the street, and, oddly, that Claire's building permit had missing context. The city's office forwarded the complaints to Claire out of protocol. She read them, sighed, and forwarded back documentation that countered every one of Karen's claims. The fence was always going to be a point of contention. Claire had designed it to be functional, privacy-respecting, and grounded in natural materials. Not some bland vinyl cutout, but a well-constructed barrier of cedar slats set vertically, interspaced with climbing trellises to host flowering vines that would, over time, form a living wall. The structure followed the surveyed boundary exactly. She had triple-checked that, but it did something else too. It blocked off the informal footpath that, for decades, had allowed residents like Karen to cut through the lot for convenience. Technically, the path was not public. It had never been formalized, never codified in easements or preserved by right-of-way. It was just something people had gotten used to. So, when the fence posts went up and the outlines of that familiar shortcut vanished behind what would soon be a solid wooden barrier, Karen took it as a personal affront. Not because it broke any law, it didn't, but because it dared to change what had always been, even if what had always been had no legal standing. Claire knew this reaction would come. What she didn't expect was the speed and intensity of the pushback. Within a day of the fence taking form, someone had driven a garden stake through one of the post holes. The crew called her about it, thought it was odd. The next day, one of the newly set panels had been pried loose and left leaning at an angle. By the third day, Claire arrived early in the morning to find a paper note stapled to the temporary permit board. This barrier is illegal. It restricts historical access to community members. Remove it before we escalate. There was no signature, just a typed line. Concerned Residents Group. Claire had seen enough bureaucratic theater to know when someone was bluffing. The letter's tone was passive-aggressive enough to amuse her, but it was the choice of words that really caught her attention. Illegal. Historical access. Community members. These weren't just grievances, they were the pretext to a campaign. Someone was laying groundwork for an escalation, and Claire, being who she was, wasn't going to take the bait emotionally. She wasn't going to rip down her plans or file a counterletter full of indignation. She was going to respond as a planner, not a neighbor. She was going to do what they never expected. She logged into her work portal that evening, pulled up the parcel data and complaint registry, and began the process of formally addressing the letter, not as a homeowner, but as the municipal official responsible for adjudicating land use concerns in that district. It wasn't unethical. She had every right to open the file, and what she saw only confirmed her instincts. The complaint had been submitted by email from a generic address, Freedom Neighborhood Watch 2020@gmail.com. But the attachment metadata revealed the document had been edited by Karen Lawrence. Whether Karen realized who the complaint would go to was unclear, but the irony wasn't lost on Claire. She closed the document, saved a copy, and leaned back in her chair. This wasn't about offense. It was about control. About someone who'd grown used to acting as the gatekeeper of a neighborhood slowly finding out that the gates no longer responded to her hand. Claire wasn't angry. She was calm, methodical even. She'd worked through too many real conflicts to be rattled by someone like Karen. What she needed now wasn't a confrontation. It was clarity, and she intended to get it the only way that mattered, officially. Because if Karen wanted a process, Claire was going to give her the full process. Every form, every inspection, every technicality. She wasn't going to win by yelling. She was going to win because the law, quite literally, was on her side. And Karen had just reported her fence to the very person authorized to rule on it. The city's complaint review protocol didn't allow for anonymity, not really. Even if a complaint was submitted under a vague group name or via an untraceable email address, the submission system still recorded metadata, timestamps, IP addresses, document authorship when applicable. That was intentional, a safeguard against frivolous accusations and vendettas disguised as civic responsibility. Claire knew this system intimately because she had helped implement its current iteration just 2 years ago. So, when she opened the formal complaint against the fence on her personal property, flagged internally as a potential conflict of interest because her name appeared in the permit, she was both amused and professionally compelled to treat it by the book. The irony that her own name triggered an ethics review was not lost on her, and she took care to escalate the matter to her direct supervisor and file an abstention of decision authority as procedure required. But what she was still allowed to do, at least until a new adjudicator was assigned, was examine the contents of the file. The complaint itself was short, poorly formatted and full of inflated language. It claimed the fence had interrupted a traditional community pathway used for decades by local residents, and suggested it posed safety hazards due to obstructed visibility, despite the fence being a standard height and placed fully within code. There were no maps, no formal documentation of the so-called pathway's existence, and no corroborating evidence that it had ever been publicly designated. Instead, the file included a few low-resolution photos, one taken from a sidewalk across the street, another awkwardly angled from the rear of Claire's property line, and a PDF file with the heading Community Support. Inside were 15 digital signatures, all first names only, some duplicates, and 2 with no entry at all. It was the sort of complaint Claire would normally dismiss within minutes, not because she didn't take community input seriously, but because it lacked the basic components of a viable case. But this was different, not because of its merits, which were laughable, but because of who had filed it and where it had landed. Karen Lawrence had not only authored the complaint, she had submitted it directly to the department's inbox for infrastructure violations, mistakenly assuming it would bypass Claire's purview. But it didn't. The system automatically routed land use disputes by parcel ID, and since Claire's name was associated with that property, it had landed squarely on her screen. Flagged, yes, but visible all the same, and that alone shifted the entire tone of what had up to now been an irritating but containable neighborly conflict. This was no longer a woman gossiping over hedges or writing angry posts in a neighborhood forum. This was Karen trying to invoke the power of the city government to compel action on false grounds, and she had accidentally given that power directly to the person she hoped to manipulate. Claire didn't smile when she read the complaint. She didn't mutter some triumphant line or lean back with satisfaction. What she felt was colder than that. It was the same mental shift she made when reviewing a fraudulent permit application or catching a developer using doctored documents to sneak past height restrictions. It was a tightening of professional posture, a steel thread of procedural focus weaving through her thoughts. She closed the file without comment and began drafting her disclosures to the oversight board. Within the hour, she had initiated the reassignment of the case to a peer officer in a neighboring district, ensuring that no one could claim bias when the decision ultimately landed. That done, she turned off her office lights, locked the door, and walked home with a mind that was already building a quiet, unshakable response. But Karen, of course, didn't know any of this. She had no idea that Claire had received the complaint personally, nor that she had already handed it off to a colleague for independent review. Karen, as far as anyone could tell, believed she had launched a campaign that would now grind forward through the city's bureaucratic gears until it produced a satisfying result. Namely, the forced removal of a fence she found personally inconvenient, and because Karen was not one to operate in silence, her confidence quickly manifested in new forms. By the end of the week, Claire began noticing small changes around the neighborhood. Flyers appeared on telephone poles and under windshield wipers. Plain white sheets with bold black text stating, "Protect community access. Say no to private barriers," followed by a link to a hastily created petition page. The language mimicked civil rights rhetoric, invoking freedom of movement and shared heritage routes, as though Claire's cedar fence were a barbed wire barricade erected in wartime. The site hosting the petition had a single post explaining the issue from Karen's perspective, identifying Claire only as a city insider using her connections to impose private interests. It didn't name her directly, but the context was unmistakable. It didn't have to be overt. The damage was in the implication. Neighbors began approaching Claire more frequently, though none of them seemed particularly hostile. One woman, Margaret, from 2 houses down, brought over a jar of preserves and mentioned the situation with a careful tone, clearly hoping for gossip. A retired couple from the adjacent block waved her over while she watered her small patch of native grasses and asked if she'd heard about the lady causing all the trouble. Claire answered neutrally, refusing to confirm or deny anything. She had no desire to stoke fires that might burn themselves out naturally. Still, the undertone was growing louder. Then, one night, just after dusk, Claire returned from the grocery store and noticed the silhouette of someone standing close to the rear section of her fence. She parked quietly, turned off her headlights early, and watched as the figure stood still for several minutes, apparently inspecting the wood grain, or perhaps just looming for effect. When she stepped out of her car and closed the door deliberately, the figure shifted and disappeared into the shadows of the sidewalk trees. It wasn't enough to call the police. Nothing had been damaged, no lines crossed, but the message was clear. Someone wanted her to feel watched. Claire responded, as always, with precision. She documented the time, the weather, her return from the store, and the direction the figure moved. She didn't speculate about who it was. The next morning, she purchased 2 additional motion-activated floodlights and had them installed at the corners of her yard. Not as a threat, just a gentle reminder that her property was monitored and protected. She didn't make a social media post or speak about it publicly. She didn't need to. Her actions were, as ever, recorded and deliberate. What finally pushed the situation into formal escalation came not from a person, but from a letter. Delivered via courier with a carbon copy signature from a local attorney. It cited her property's address and informed her of an intent to file suit over interference with implied historical access. It was nonsense, of course. There was no legal precedent for such a claim without formal easement. But it was now a documented legal threat. And it bore the unmistakable name of its client, Karen Lawrence. Claire didn't react with panic. She sat at her dining room table and read the document twice, sipping tea she'd brewed hours earlier and forgotten to finish. She placed the letter neatly into a file folder marked Fence Dispute, and then opened her laptop. Her next 3 emails were short, direct, and sent without hesitation. To her lawyer, to her department's ethics officer, and to the city's public relations liaison. Not because she planned to make noise, but because she understood the weight of optics. She needed every action moving forward to be pristine, unimpeachable, and fully in compliance with both city and civil standards. She had seen how quickly these kinds of disputes could spiral if not documented properly, and she had no intention of letting Karen steer the narrative. What Karen hadn't realized, and perhaps could never fully grasp, was that by trying to drag Claire into a legal corner, she had stepped into a world Claire knew better than almost anyone. The city, the codes, the loopholes and protections, the very frameworks Karen hoped to weaponize, they were Claire's language. And now that Karen had invoked them formally, Claire wasn't just allowed to respond. She was obligated to. And this time, it wouldn't be Claire's name on the ruling. Claire had always believed that escalation wasn't something you initiated. It was something you controlled. Most conflicts, particularly the ones that came disguised as neighborly disputes, didn't explode overnight. They simmered, thick with passive signals and strategic silences, before a single spark tipped them into combustion. And in this case, the spark came quietly, disguised not as a direct threat, but as a procedural request from the city's legal department. The letter was polite, even routine in tone, asking her to temporarily recuse herself from any ongoing land use cases involving her district, while an internal review took place concerning a perceived conflict of interest involving private property and professional position. It wasn't an accusation, it was a precaution. But Claire understood the subtext. The letter had been prompted by Karen's attorney, who had filed a formal ethics complaint alongside the notice of intent to sue. The allegation, vague by design, suggested that Claire's position with the city might have given her undue advantage during the approval of her fencing permit, despite the fact that all documentation had been submitted through third-party channels and reviewed independently. It was a move designed not to win in court, but to stall, to create shadows where none existed and leverage them for public sympathy. And while Claire wasn't surprised, she was, briefly, angry. Not furious or panicked, but that slow, internal anger that tightens in the ribs and builds behind the eyes. She set the letter aside and adjusted her calendar, forwarding ongoing projects to colleagues without explanation. She would not fight the review. It would pass as it had to, because she had done everything correctly. But what she needed now was distance, not from the work, but from the appearance of impropriety. She had always understood that justice wasn't just about being right, it was about being seen to be right. Karen, however, read the review as a victory. Within days, she became more visible. Her voice rang out louder during walks through the neighborhood. Her posture shifted when they crossed paths at the market, no longer tight with confrontation, but breezy with entitlement. And then came the signs. Printed in heavy ink, laminated against the elements and zip-tied to metal stakes, they began appearing in the small grass verge between sidewalk and street. Reclaim the path. Stop unfair fencing. Each one sat just far enough from Claire's property to avoid legal interference, but close enough to implicate her by proximity. A QR code led to Karen's petition page, now rebranded as a Movement for Community Space Preservation. The language had grown more sophisticated, mimicking the tone of public policy initiatives and urban development critiques. Karen had found someone, perhaps a retired consultant or a well-meaning neighbor, who knew how to shape opinion. The website even included a downloadable PDF with documentation of the historical pathway, complete with anecdotal statements from longtime residents about walking their dogs along that fence line since 1989. But anecdotes didn't make law. Claire knew this. Still, perception had power, and when perception was combined with repetition, it became something that could not be ignored. She began receiving polite but cautious inquiries from neighbors she had previously only waved to in passing. Some wanted clarification. Others just wanted to signal neutrality. She never raised her voice, never acted defensive. She listened, nodded, and reminded them that she welcomed due process, that she supported city transparency, that she had filed no complaints in return. It was the lack of retaliation that unnerved Karen most. That much became clear when Claire received a call from her attorney about a new filing, a motion seeking temporary injunction on further construction along the fence line, citing ongoing community harm. Claire wasn't building anything new, but the claim painted her as if she might be, as if the fence were the beginning of some encroaching development meant to wall off the neighborhood from itself. Then came the damage. One morning, after a night of soft rain, Claire stepped outside and noticed that several of the flowering vines she'd planted along the inner side of the fence were slashed near the root. Not ripped up. Cut cleanly, as if with shears or a utility knife. The cuts were precise, just low enough to go unnoticed unless you knelt to inspect them. She crouched, examining the damage without touching the stems. This wasn't vandalism born of frustration. This was a message, one carved in the quiet where no camera had yet been pointed. Claire did what she always did. She documented. Photos, timestamps, weather conditions, shoe prints near the soil. Then she drove to the nursery and bought replacements. Not because she was naive or because she believed the cuts wouldn't return, but because planting new growth was its own kind of statement. It said, "I'm not moving, I'm not afraid, and I am watching too." But Karen wasn't working alone anymore. That became apparent the next time Claire received a letter, not from Karen, but from the Neighborhood Advisory Committee. It was a formal invitation to a discussion forum, scheduled in the community center gymnasium, open to all residents concerned about public access and evolving property conflicts. Her name wasn't mentioned, but her property's location was listed under Agenda Item 2. It was a trap. Dressed up in language about dialogue and community values, but built to corner her in public. Claire RSVP'd immediately, attending. When she walked into the gymnasium on the night of the forum, the air was already thick with tension. Chairs were arranged in a wide circle, too wide for real conversation. People sat with their arms crossed, eyes shifting whenever she moved. Karen stood near the podium, smiling like a woman preparing to auction something she'd already sold. Claire took her seat calmly, a legal pad in her lap, her expression unreadable. The meeting began with general announcements, petty concerns about street lighting and recycling bins, before the moderator moved to the second item. We've received a number of concerns regarding restricted access along the east boundary path, he began, deliberately avoiding names. We'd like to open the floor to discussion, ensuring we respect all sides. Karen spoke first. Her voice was smooth, practiced, heavy with the faux humility of someone who'd rehearsed every phrase in the mirror. She spoke about heritage, about the value of informal trails, about how some things aren't on the books but live in the hearts of a community. She used the phrase unneighborly tactics twice and invoked her late husband's belief in open space for children. She never once said Claire's name, but every eye in the room turned toward her by the end. Claire waited for silence. Then she rose, not with drama but with measured weight, and opened her folder. She held no speech, no emotional appeal. What she carried were facts. Satellite images from the past 10 years showing no trail where Karen claimed one had existed. Correspondence from the city confirming her property lines. A notarized affidavit from the previous land surveyor affirming no historical easement had ever been recorded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She let the facts sit in the air like calm water after a storm. When she finished, she returned to her seat. No applause followed, but neither did rebuttal. Karen's expression had changed, no longer triumphant but brittle. The moderator cleared his throat and moved the meeting forward, but the temperature in the room had shifted. The power Karen had gathered through implication and noise had just been answered with silence and proof. The next morning, Claire found a single item in her mailbox, a blank envelope, unmarked, containing only a photograph. It was her fence, taken from the sidewalk at night, lit by the flash of a phone. Nothing else. No note. No context. Just a reminder. We're watching. She held the photo between her fingers for a long moment before sliding it into a folder with the others. She wasn't afraid. But the escalation had taken its next step, and Claire, though calm, understood now what kind of battle this would become. It was a Tuesday morning when Claire received the call from Miles Radner, a compliance officer from District 7 who had been assigned to review the fence dispute once Claire formally recused herself. They had worked together professionally on a few interdepartmental reviews. Miles was meticulous, a bit humorless, but competent in a way that rarely invited pushback. Claire respected him, mostly because he refused to speculate. He followed the paper, not the personalities. So when he asked her to stop by his office for a quick conversation, off record, but not off the record, she understood it wasn't a social courtesy. Something had shifted. The moment she stepped into his narrow office space, it became clear he wasn't interested in pleasantries. He gestured to the chair, closed the door, and set a thick manila folder between them on the desk. No logo, no tab, just paper, densely packed and deliberately compiled. Some of this is normal, some of it isn't, he began, tapping the folder like it might protest. There's been a pattern of activity coming from the complainant, Lawrence, that started even before you broke ground. Multiple open records requests, some under other names. She's been building a file on your property for months, maybe longer. Claire said nothing, simply leaned forward and began to scan the contents. The documents were a mix: downloaded satellite images, grainy phone photos from various angles, and printouts from online databases showing tax records, surveyor maps, zoning codes, some current, others outdated and annotated by hand. Someone had gone through city archives, and not casually. A few pages were even highlighted in colors matching internal use markers, a signal that perhaps a municipal contact had helped pull them. That made Claire pause. "She's fishing for precedent," Miles continued, watching her carefully, "trying to establish some kind of implied public right based on the idea that the land had been functionally shared before development. But she doesn't have the one thing that matters: formal documentation. She's trying to reverse engineer authority through volume." Claire nodded slowly. She understood the tactic. Overwhelm the system with circumstantial fragments and hope something, somewhere, looks damning enough to trigger action. It wasn't uncommon in land disputes. People who couldn't win with facts often tried to create enough confusion that city departments either backed off or compromised just to avoid the noise. "But there's something else," Miles added, flipping the folder closed. "We've traced 2 open record requests that link back to your personnel file. Not publicly accessible requests, internal data. Someone used a third-party form to ask for details about your hiring, your current review authority, and whether your permits are subject to audit. Those requests were rejected, but they triggered alerts." Claire's expression didn't change, but her chest tightened subtly. This wasn't just about offense anymore. This was a character attack forming beneath the surface, one that didn't accuse directly but sought to plant doubt in the right ears. If even one senior official started to believe she'd bypassed procedure, it wouldn't matter that she hadn't. The insinuation would be enough to stall her career, delay promotions, isolate her within a department she had helped strengthen for years. "I'll be candid," Miles said. "The only reason I'm telling you this now is because your file is clean. Impeccable, actually, but if this continues, it won't stay in my jurisdiction. Someone higher will want to look like they're taking it seriously." Claire leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling for a moment. She'd played every step by the rules, and still, she was being drawn into a conflict designed not to win, but to wear her down, piece by piece, until resistance seemed harder than compliance. That was the real strategy here. Not legal victory, but attrition. She left Miles's office without speaking further, but with a folder in her bag and a fire in her chest that didn't feel like anger. It felt like resolve. Back at home, the fence stood exactly as it had before. Quiet, clean, framed by fresh plantings and the soft sounds of early afternoon birdsong. It was almost insulting how calm everything looked. Claire stepped inside, removed her coat, and opened her laptop. She wasn't going to play detective. She wasn't going to stalk Karen or mount a counter-campaign. But she would begin recording everything, not just for legal defense, but for clarity. Note-taking, time-stamping, cross-referencing. Every interaction, every letter, every visual change on the property. Not to build a case, but to prevent one from being built around her. 2 days later, she got a text from her lawyer, Marie Shapiro. It was a screenshot of a neighborhood message board, one of the ones Claire had avoided since the drama began. In the post, Karen was responding to a sympathetic comment from another user, stating that the issue may need to escalate through public channels if the city continues to ignore the voice of its own people. That was the moment Marie stepped in. "Harder. She's laying the groundwork for public protest," Marie warned over the phone. "If this gets performative, you're going to need visible credibility, not just paperwork. I suggest bringing in a third-party inspection firm. Independent, out of state if possible. Let them evaluate everything and file a neutral report. If this ever reaches a hearing, we lead with that." Claire agreed immediately. The next morning, she scheduled a full audit with a private surveying and compliance group known for its neutrality and transparency. They arrived 3 days later in plain vans, without logos, and worked discreetly for 6 hours measuring fence lines, checking drainage slope, evaluating visibility angles for traffic safety, and inspecting foundation compliance. The lead inspector didn't say much at the time, just shook Claire's hand and promised a full report within 72 hours. When the report arrived, it was perfect. The fence not only met standards, it exceeded several, particularly in its drainage mitigation and the use of permeable ground cover near the base. The report cited above-average care in residential boundary implementation and no identifiable encroachment or code deviation. Claire forwarded the report to her legal team, to the city ethics officer, and to Miles Radner with a simple note. 4. Your records. And then she waited. The waiting was always the hardest part, not because of anxiety, but because of the silence. People like Karen didn't respond to facts with apologies. They retreated, recalibrated, and looked for other angles. Claire knew something else would come soon. She just didn't know what form it would take. She found out the following week. An anonymous tip had been submitted to the fire marshal's office claiming that her fence obstructed potential emergency access and created a combustible zone due to its wooden material and surrounding vegetation. It was ridiculous. The fence was 20 feet from the house, treated cedar with a flame-retardant sealant, surrounded by low-irrigation native plants. But the tip triggered a mandatory inspection. Claire didn't argue. She welcomed the inspector, offered him coffee, and walked him around the perimeter herself. He was cordial, amused even. "You'd be surprised how many of these we get after neighbor disputes," he said. "Usually nothing. But protocol's protocol." His report, submitted the next day, read, "No obstruction. No hazard. No citation recommended." Claire filed that one, too. Another entry in the log. Another page in the record. The pattern was growing, clear and undeniable. Karen wasn't trying to win a single argument. She was trying to bury Claire in a swarm of manufactured problems, hoping that eventually something would stick. But what she failed to account for was that Claire didn't just know the system, she believed in it. And now that belief was turning into something sharper. She would not be pushed out of her home. She would not apologize for building something clean, legal, and carefully designed, and she would not let Karen write the story. Not now, not ever. Claire knew that escalation, once it crossed the second threshold, rarely returned to civility. The first round had been manageable, a localized storm of resentment and procedural skirmishes that she had weathered with calm documentation and polite professionalism. But something had shifted after the fire inspection. Karen, seeing her efforts repeatedly nullified by formal reports and neutral verdicts, abandoned her performative neighborhood grievances and began funneling her energy into darker, more targeted maneuvers. What had once been a passive-aggressive crusade against offense was becoming a strategic assault on Claire's professional credibility and psychological endurance. The first sign came not through a letter, not through a complaint, but through silence. There were no new flyers, no sidewalk encounters, no sudden phone calls from journalists or neighbors. It was as if Karen had disappeared from the battlefield, and for a few days Claire almost believed the war was over. She tended to her home with quiet precision, planting new vines along the inner stretch of the fence and hosting a landscape consultant to plan a low-irrigation garden that would double as a stormwater buffer. But that peace was a pause, not an end. On the fourth morning of that silence, Claire opened her email to find a forwarded message from the city's human resources liaison, flagged for immediate review. The email was a formal notice. A third-party ethics investigator had been retained by the municipal board to look into allegations of misuse of administrative privilege and inappropriate influence on permit approval processes. The phrasing was familiar. It mirrored, almost word for word, the kind of language Claire herself had used when investigating internal violations. But this time, it was her name in the subject line. The inquiry was based not on a single event, but on an accumulating pattern of concern submitted by multiple anonymous sources. Multiple sources? Claire stared at the screen, knowing exactly what that meant. Karen had found others, perhaps disgruntled residents, perhaps friends with time and bitterness to spare, and had organized them into a loose coalition willing to submit identical complaints, staggered by time and tone to simulate independent concern. It was smart, not legally tight, not provable in court, but persuasive in a bureaucratic setting that prioritized optics over confrontation. The city had to appear diligent. And so, Claire was informed, an external audit would review every permit she had touched in the last 18 months. It was a professional nightmare. Not because she had done anything wrong, she hadn't, but because the audit itself, once opened, couldn't be controlled. Every review, every signature, every email, every timestamp would be parsed by someone who didn't know her, didn't know the politics behind the complaints, and wouldn't care. Claire was confident in her work, but the burden of proof wasn't on the accusers. It was now on her. She contacted Marie, her attorney, and spent the rest of the day compiling a digital archive of every document she'd processed since joining the department. Each file was labeled, indexed, and hyperlinked to procedural codes. She worked through the evening and into the early morning, stopping only to stretch and reheat a forgotten cup of tea. It was the kind of work she excelled at, clean, focused, controlled, but underneath her methodical rhythm ran a steady current of fury. Not the kind that flared in public, but the deep, smoldering kind that anchored itself in the spine. 3 days into the audit, Claire's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was clipped, male, and spoke in the kind of rushed confidence that only came from someone used to being ignored. He introduced himself as a retired surveyor, formerly contracted with the city on various infill development projects. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Look, I've seen what they're doing. The complaints, the records, the so-called path dispute. I was the one who mapped that whole block before the housing crash. There was never a recorded easement, not even an informal one. I tried telling them that when one of the petition people showed up last month asking for legacy maps." Claire sat up straighter. "Someone came to you directly?" "Yes," the man replied, exasperated. "I told them no such thing existed, that the lot was always privately held. A few days later, my name showed up in one of their online forums saying I confirmed community use dating back to 1990. I didn't. I never said that." "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" Claire asked, already reaching for a pen. "I already did," he replied. "I emailed your legal office this morning. I've got nothing to hide, just tired of being used." It was the first real crack in the wall Karen had built around her story. Claire forwarded the message to Marie, who confirmed its receipt and added it to the growing archive of defense evidence. But the call did something more important. It reminded Claire that she wasn't isolated, that the network Karen had tried to fabricate was brittle, dependent on fear, misdirection, and the assumption that no one would bother to speak up once implicated. But some would, and that mattered. The next blow, however, came from a completely unexpected direction. Claire's mortgage lender contacted her regarding an inquiry into the structural permit of her fence, claiming a citizen concern had triggered a review of property compliance tied to her loan agreement. The language was vague, but the implication was clear. Someone, Karen almost certainly, had contacted the bank directly, hoping to scare the institution into believing that the fence posed a liability. It was the financial equivalent of whispering "fire" in a crowded theater. Claire took the call calmly, then immediately provided the lender with copies of the private inspection report, city permits, and the fire marshal's findings. It was enough to satisfy them. For now. But the brazenness of the tactic rattled her. This wasn't a procedural maneuver. This was sabotage. Marie called that night, her tone sharp. "We need to go offensive. I've drafted a formal cease and desist notice against Lawrence and any affiliated individuals making defamatory statements or engaging in third-party interference with your financial and professional obligations. If she responds, we go public. If she doesn't, we file an injunction." Claire didn't argue. It was time. The notice was served quietly. No theatrics, no threats. Just a clean legal warning delivered through proper channels. Karen didn't respond. Not at first. But the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was compression. A coiling of pressure like air thickening before a storm. The storm broke 1 week later. Someone filed a request with the zoning board for a community variance, allowing for a commemorative walkway to be designated along the property line of Claire's lot. It was absurd on every level. No such provision existed in the code, but it triggered an automatic administrative hearing. And because the request involved public access, the hearing was required to be open, which meant it would be weaponized. Marie and Claire arrived early the morning of the hearing, armed with evidence, affidavits, inspection reports, and a concise argument prepared not to defend, but to disassemble. The board was composed of seasoned officials who had seen hundreds of baseless filings, but even they seemed mildly surprised by the theatrical presence of Karen and her small entourage. They wore matching lapel pins shaped like tiny footsteps. Karen spoke first. She delivered a monologue about shared space, the legacy of informal paths, the emotional geography of neighborhoods, and the chilling impact of barriers in an era of division. It was impressive, if ungrounded, an emotional appeal wrapped in socio-political language designed not to persuade on legal merit, but to evoke sentiment. Then Claire stood. She didn't bring a speech. She brought maps, data, testimony. She displayed 10 years of aerial imagery showing the lot untouched, the fence line undeveloped, the path non-existent. She presented the original property deed, the lack of easement, the inspection reports, and finally she presented a notarized letter from the retired surveyor. Her voice never rose. She didn't appeal to emotion. She simply showed the truth. The board ruled unanimously against the variance. The filing was rejected. The record sealed with formal language. No historical access established. No municipal right-of-way applicable. No cause for override of property boundaries. Karen's entourage left without speaking, but the silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't strategic. It was surrender. Claire knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't admit defeat. But something had broken. Not just the campaign against her fence, but the illusion that Karen controlled the neighborhood narrative. The board's ruling, publicly recorded and accessible, was a weapon Claire would never need to wield again. Its presence was enough. The fence remained. And so did Claire. Karen did not vanish, not completely. The aftermath of the zoning board hearing had left her exposed. Not in the legal sense, but in the far more devastating social sense that occurs when the foundation of a persona collapses in the face of undeniable fact. The neighborhood, which had once murmured in hesitant agreement with her language of access and legacy, now stood at a quiet, calculated distance. No one challenged her, no one confronted her directly, but the shift was palpable. Where once her walks were punctuated with greetings and nods of solidarity, now she moved as if through glass. Visible, intact, but sealed off. Claire observed this change from the periphery, not as a source of vindication, but as a necessary confirmation that the tide had turned. She had not won by overpowering Karen. She had prevailed by refusing to be dragged into a war of performances. She had chosen the terrain of truth, and on that ground Karen had slipped. But just because Karen had retreated did not mean the consequences of her campaign evaporated. The audit of Claire's professional history, though now without momentum, continued its slow grind through the city's external ethics process. The department heads, though no longer cold, remained cautious. Trust, once questioned, did not rebound overnight. Claire knew this, and she made no effort to rush its repair. Instead, she focused on her work, documented everything with renewed rigor, and remained deliberately present in the spaces Karen had hoped to exile her from. She didn't retreat. She occupied. Not in aggression, but in permanence. One morning, nearly a month after the hearing, Claire received an unexpected call from the city's Risk and Safety Division. A report had been flagged by a routine inspection sweep, and though it wasn't formally linked to her, it concerned the neighboring property, Karen's. The inspector, during a random street compliance check, had noticed what appeared to be an exposed drainage pipe running from Karen's back garden directly beneath her side yard into the shared municipal runoff line. The pipe, partially hidden under a false patch of gravel, had no permit on file, no backflow prevention, and no registered environmental mitigation. It had likely been installed years ago, but recent heavy rains had disturbed the soil enough to expose its mouth. What had seemed like a rock bed had become, upon closer review, an unauthorized stormwater channel funneling runoff across multiple lot boundaries. Claire didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply requested a copy of the report for her records and thanked the officer for the notice. But what followed was a cascade of procedural consequences. Karen received an official citation, followed by an order to dismantle the illegal pipe and submit to a full property inspection. The enforcement was not personal. It was automatic. But in the wake of her own campaign against Claire, it was poetic. The inspection unearthed more. Karen's rear deck, rebuilt 2 years prior without permit, had extended 6 feet beyond the approved footprint. Her trash storage structure violated setback regulations by 2 feet. Most damning, her garage, converted years ago into a hobby room, had undergone unpermitted electrical rewiring that now failed fire code standards. These were not malicious violations. They were the kind of quiet, homeowner-driven alterations that many older residents conducted without much thought. But the system Karen had weaponized now turned its lens on her, and the rules she had tried to twist into a sword came back at her like a mirror. Claire received no notice of the actions. She found out through the neighborhood email digest, where administrative bulletins posted public enforcement actions as part of transparency policy. Karen's address appeared 3 times that month, each line item accompanied by formal descriptions and compliance deadlines. There was no mention of Claire, no acknowledgement of irony, but anyone paying attention could connect the dots. Weeks passed. Karen stopped walking past Claire's home. The signs disappeared. The petitions vanished. The QR code website returned a 404 error. Claire began to reclaim silence. Not the tense, bracing kind of earlier months, but the genuine stillness that comes when tension releases and nothing waits on the other side. But the true culmination came not through the city, nor through enforcement. It arrived one morning in the form of a real estate agent's business card wedged neatly into the edge of Karen's mailbox. By noon, a for sale sign stood at the edge of Karen's yard, just within legal bounds. The listing appeared online the following week, worded carefully, delicately. Charming residence in a close-knit neighborhood with access to green space and community amenities. No mention of disputes. No trace of what had transpired. Claire watched the listing from a distance. She didn't check its views, didn't read the comments. She had no need. Her victory had never been about driving Karen out. It had been about resisting the pressure to bend, to doubt, to retreat. Karen leaving was not the goal. It was the natural conclusion to a war she had started on a lie and could no longer sustain. A few days before the house changed status to pending, Claire received a package in her mailbox. No name, no return address, just a padded envelope with a photograph inside. It was the same photo that had once been left anonymously, her fence at night, flashlit, stark and solitary. But this time, someone had written on the back in small, tight script, "We thought we could scare you. We were wrong." Claire read the words twice, then folded the photo and placed it in the folder she'd kept since the first complaint. She didn't react, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer changed anything. The fence remained. So did the silence. So did she. The day the moving truck arrived, Claire didn't look out the window. She heard it, of course. The compressed hiss of hydraulic brakes, the thump of the lift gate, the low murmur of men coordinating loadouts in a practiced rhythm. But she did not pause her work. She had a spreadsheet open, an update to a community transit zoning overlay she'd been helping draft for weeks. The numbers didn't care who was leaving. They asked only for accuracy. And Claire, as always, gave it. Karen's departure was quiet. There were no farewell gatherings, no final walks through the neighborhood. She left as she had tried to govern, indirectly through others without acknowledgement. The house emptied in under 5 hours. The curtains were left behind. A wind chime clinked briefly, then stilled, and then it was done. Claire stepped outside just before dusk. The air smelled of dry grass and warmed concrete. The for sale sign was gone. The yard across the street was bare. She walked to her mailbox, removed a stack of city mailers, and stood there for a moment longer than necessary, letting the silence settle. It was not victory she felt, not triumph or relief. It was the absence of weight. The lifting of a pressure so constant that she hadn't realized how deeply it had pressed into her until it was gone. Neighbors began to reappear over the following weeks. Not all at once and not dramatically, but subtly, like green shoots after a long frost. One man asked about the name of her landscaper. Another offered a bag of lemons from his tree. A woman from the far end of the block invited her to a weekend garden tour. They didn't mention the past, and she didn't remind them. The neighborhood wasn't healed, but it was breathing again. Claire took what was offered and gave what she could in return. No bitterness, no notes, just presence. The fence remained untouched. Vines had begun to climb. The cedar had weathered into a soft silver gray, stronger now than when it was new. Children rode their bikes along the sidewalk beside it. Dogs sniffed its base, and no one tried to cross it. In time, the audit into Claire's professional conduct concluded with a formal exoneration. The findings were circulated quietly. All procedures followed, no irregularities found, no cause for discipline or review. Her supervisor met with her privately, thanked her for her patience, and asked if she'd consider mentoring a junior officer in the department. She accepted without hesitation. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she understood how systems stayed honest, through steady, watchful hands. Months passed. Karen's house sold to a family from out of state. They moved in with little fanfare, hung planters from the porch, painted the trim a shade lighter. They never asked about the history. Claire never told them. One evening, as autumn approached and the sky flushed gold behind the trees, Claire sat on her porch with a book open but unread. She watched the street, the slope of her yard, the long shadow cast by the fence. She thought about her grandmother, who had once stood on this land and called it sanctuary, even when it was nothing but wild grass and loose wire. She thought about boundaries, not just of land, but of choice, of how easily they were tested and how quietly they held when rooted deep. She had not set out to fight, but she had refused to be moved, and that, she realized now, was enough. Claire closed her book, stood, and walked the length of her property one final time that night. The fence stood tall beside her, solid, silent, undisputed, and so did she.